Good morning, everyone. Some really exciting times right now in so-called psychedelic policy reform. This year, Denver effectively decriminalized psilocybin by making it a lowest level law enforcement priority. And then Oakland responded by making all entheogenic plants, cacti, and fungi a lowest level law enforcement priority. Yeah, let's give a round of applause for that. And what's really exciting is that these cities have clearly been inspiring others. And I want to name Dallas in particular as a Texan city that's been making some moves. Is anyone here from Dallas working on decriminalized nature? No? All right, well, thanks to you guys. And Austin, it seems that you're a little behind. Just leave it at that. But it does feel especially important to be sitting in Texas, home to the sacred and scarce peyote gardens, and home of the only American-grown peyote that can be legally sold, but only between licensed members of the Native American Church. Which is why I'm really humbled and honored that Sandor Ironrope, the former president of the Native American Church of North America and the current president of the Native American Church of South Dakota, has joined us today to speak about what we call psychedelic policy reform. I'm really grateful to be sitting here with this panel of inspiring folks who are really greatly influencing the way access to plant medicine is moving forward in the US. Today, I really hope we can think about how to create some new ways forward and avoid perpetuating some of the same damaging cycles we are working so hard to heal. So, I'm sorry. It's so hard to introduce all of you because there's just so much to be said for all of you. So I'm excited to give you guys the opportunity to speak for a few minutes, to give us a sense both of your background, the work that you do, and also how you came to be working in policy reform and reform that intersects with plant medicines and psychedelics. Jax, would you start us off?
All right, I'll start it off. First of all, hello everyone. If you're not from Texas, thank you for joining us. If you are from Texas, can I see how many of us there are here today? Hi, friends. I want to work with all of you on legalizing cannabis and moving forward talking about sacred plants. But first, let's talk about a little bit about what I do. Natalie kind of said she wanted a little bit more of like the personal background of where we come from a little bit, as well as our professional background. And so feeling this space and hearing so many people talking about sharing truly all of your authentic experiences, I'm going to share more than I normally share. I usually stick very close to the cannabis lane to stay very narrowly focused on that because that's kind of part of the struggle in Texas. But I'm going to talk about, from the beginning. I was raised in a fundamentalist Christian cult. It was a very difficult upbringing, and I knew by 9 that it wasn't authentic, and I didn't want to continue to participate in it. And by the time I was 17, or just turned 17, my parents decided to shun me and kick me out of the house. And so I was homeless for a few days before I was adopted by a really awesome family. And on April 20th, I moved into their home and I smoked marijuana for the first time. And it was really awesome. That was back in 1999, so it's my 20-year anniversary with my favorite plant ally.
Mazel tov.
Thank you. But that was very traumatic, the way that I was raised and the way that I ended up separating from my family. And so I took what I've come to understand is a hero's journey level of psilocybin with my new group of friends and my new siblings. And I discovered several iterations of myself along a 12-hour journey, and it was very interesting. But I found it not only healing, which I think is something that we've talked about a lot here at the conference, but I also found it to be very bonding. And so I really felt connected with my new family. I really felt like I was acclimating with it. And moving forward, through my life, it's a kind of, you touched on continuing trauma a little bit in your panel yesterday. And since I still have no relationship with my biological family, it is a sort of continuing trauma that I try to deal with in the best way I possibly can. So I go about my life, living my life, get married, have a child, and I did go through some pretty extreme birth trauma. I was a doula for a long time, so I've helped bring children into the world, and I had a home birth myself that lasted 38 hours. And that's when I realized that I was really tapped into my power, and the trauma afterwards, having people surrounding me that it was, I didn't leave the house for 30 days, and my community really took care of me. And so that was just like a super bonding experience. And I found through being a doula that, birth is kind of psychedelic, and being there and being present with the mother and her family, you really tap into that, and it really grounds you to have purpose in the circle of life. And so I found I got involved with Texas Normal back in 2005. I met them at a political meeting. The executive director at the time was super awesome, loved his wife, so I started getting involved. I worked as a volunteer coordinator and helped coordinate the first lobby day in Texas, which was around 2009. There was 16 people, but we were strong, and we were going to go and do our work. And while I was going on lobby visits with a veteran, a staffer, kind of, I get pretty upset about it, but they laughed at him and kind of just said he wanted to get high. And it was really heartbreaking because he had just really shared, I'm a crier, so FYI. He just shared really personal stories and been really real about who he was. And that's what they gave him back. And so that kind of solidified me in wanting to fight really hard to make sure that we can better understand people with trauma, and we can destigmatize this illicit drug idea that people have. And so we continued to do work, and in 2012, so many people wanted to know where people stood on the cannabis front, on the issue, but League of Women Voters wasn't asking about it. People weren't really talking about it. So I decided we were going to start a voter's guide. And so every election cycle since 2012, we've been growing it, making sure that people can look up what are their legislators' voting records, where do they stand on the issue. And during this whole time, there's kind of these two, what I would call legacy bills that kept being introduced. One was an affirmative defense, which basically said if you were caught with marijuana and your doctor had told you you should use it, that you could use that defense in court. Now, it doesn't prevent you from getting arrested and all of that, but you could defend yourself. And then the other one was a very low-level decriminalization bill for, a half of an ounce. But finally, in 2013, we started seeing more substantive bills being authored. And in 2015, the Texas Compassionate Use program was passed into law. Now, there were much better bills that were out there, but unfortunately in Texas, our legislator is not, they're not deeply in tune necessarily with public policy, with the people all of the time. And so they chose the most restrictive possible bill. It is a low THC cannabis bill, and at that time it only helped people with intractable epilepsy. And that was an amazing thing to know that marijuana was being grown in Texas for patients and that some people would benefit from it. But it was also disappointing to see it be so limited. So we really started taking it to the next level, working within the political platforms to make sure that they are supportive of cannabis. So, we've been talking about making it a bipartisan issue, and I feel like in Texas, we've really started to succeed at that because we have Republicans that are authoring thoughtful bills and co-authoring other bills. The Democratic platform has a very robust cannabis platform plank. But also the Texas GOP, the Republican Party, they have a platform that supports the rescheduling of cannabis, supports the hemp program that has been instituted. It supports reducing an ounce or less to a fine. And it also supports letting doctors decide on how medical cannabis is used. And so after the 2017 cycle, I realized that Texas Normal is a C4, so we can do all the lobbying that we want to do, but we were hearing from a lot of people, we want to be able to kind of support an organization that doesn't have the word cannabis or marijuana in it. I'm afraid of it showing up on my bank statement. And so we created a sister organization, Foundation for an Informed Texas. And with that organization, we go out into rural areas and we host meetings at churches or at libraries with doctors and patients to discuss the 101 of cannabis, where we are, where is it headed. And with that foundation, we also created the first ever medical cannabis advertising program here in Texas, and it played on Fox News and MSNBC, and we were able to get 1.8 million impressions on that. So, yes. That was a really fun program to put together. And so flash forward to this year, 2019, we had a very robust legislative session. You might recall I said we had 2 legacy bills all those many years. Well, we had 64 or 63 bills related to marijuana in this session.
Wow.
Some of them arguably better than others. And the hemp program was supermajority, bipartisan out of the House, unanimous out of the Senate, signed into law on June 10th. The medical cannabis program, a very robust program, came out of the House with strong bipartisan supermajority, but the Senate decided that, well, we don't like that. And so they cut it down to maintaining the low THC program, but adding some conditions and making some other things to make it easier for physicians to participate. So we are still drastically behind on the medical freedom that we need here in Texas. We also had a bill that would have turned an ounce of possession or less into a $250 fine, and it passed out of the House with a bipartisan supermajority. It was authored by the Speaker pro tem. But when it made it to the Senate, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick decided to single-handedly kill that bill by refusing to refer it to a committee. So I want to be the wet rag in the room real quick and let everybody know that possession of under 4 ounces of marijuana in Texas is a Class C misdemeanor that comes with up to 180 days in jail, a $2,000 fine. You lose your driver's license, your right to carry your firearm, and you could potentially lose your work visa as well. If you are caught carrying a cartridge or any kind of concentrate, that is a first-degree state jail felony. So that's the law, but there's a lot of patchwork of policy of DAs and sheriff's departments that are using the discretion that they can to deprioritize or give first chance programs for people that are participate or get arrested. So for example, in Houston, they have a program where first chance diversion program that saved $27 million in its first year of implementation. Here in Texas or in Austin, there's a cite and summons policy, but also, I won't get into it too much now, but there's been some complication with hemp has been legalized with 0.3% THC or less, but hemp is marijuana. So how are you defining what marijuana you can carry and what marijuana you can't? Well, you have to test the marijuana. Well, Texas doesn't have the ability to test the marijuana because they just go, yep, that's marijuana. Looks like it. This little thing says it has THC in it, but it doesn't tell you how much it is. So a lot of the urban areas have decided to not prosecute on those charges. So some police departments are still arresting, but DAs are not charging. So it's a complicated thing where you might be okay in one area, you will not be in another. For example, I live in Williamson County, but I live inside of Austin city limits. So I'm often in Travis County. And if I were to be arrested with my plant on me, they could just put me through a diversion program if I was a citizen of Travis County. But I'm not. So I go to jail. So there's a lot of work to still be done, and I think a lot of lessons to be learned on how we've done things in Texas, how things have been done across the country, and how can not only we move forward more thoughtfully in cannabis law reform here in Texas, but how can we start to broach the other conversations that people are having about healing medicine and really self-ownership and your own decision on how you should medicate and treat yourself therapeutically or even recreationally. So that's my 5 cents on that.
Thank you so much. And thank you for leading Thank you for really leading such the complicated charge for marijuana reform in Texas. And I know before you shared, this has really been a long-standing movement in Texas in particular. I think you said Texas Normal was founded in 1972 or something?
Right before the 1973 session. And so thank you for bringing that up, because what I forgot to mention is there were 13 people serving life in jail in 1973. And so Keith Stropp came down to be like, what is up, Texas? What is wrong with y'all? And Texas Normal started from him coming down here, and they really pushed during the legislature that session, and we were able to roll back life in prison to kind of what we see now. But now we've had that bill for like 40 years, and I'm over it. We need something much more comprehensive and better.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for having me, and thank you, Natalie, for inviting me to sit on this panel with you. My name is Betty Aldworth. I'm currently the Executive Director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And do we have any SSDP students or alums in the house this morning? Can we get some hoots? Excellent. The reason that I believe that SSDP is one of the most critical vectors for this reform is because there is no movement for social change that has succeeded, certainly since the civil rights movement and probably before, without the empowered, supported, integrated voice of young people and directly impacted communities. And young people are certainly one of those most directly impacted communities of the war on drugs. We've created a system, a set of messages that suggest that we must protect young people through lies and prohibition that has been perpetrated through DARE programs, through diversion programs, through broad-scale prohibition, through discriminatory law enforcement practices worldwide in ways that are profound and deeply damaging long-term harms to human rights, both in terms of how a person experiences their life and how we think of people who use drugs. And that's where I'm coming to this work from, as a human rights activist. I don't actually remember my first protest because I was so young that protest has just always been a part of my life. But what I'll tell you, and if we're going to talk about the personal, is this. I was 12 years old when, at the annual anti-nukes protest we would go to every year on Easter after hunting for Easter eggs, when I first asked my father if I could be arrested by trespassing at the Nevada test site. And Dad said, yes, of course you can be arrested, but let me tell you what's going to happen. And I said, oh, well, maybe next year, Dad. At 13, I organized my first action, which was a profound failure in terms of how many people showed up, but a profound success in terms of teaching me how to do the work anyway and trust that people would come along if you were to continue to do that work with passion. At 14, I joined a movement by myself for the first time, the anti-apartheid movement, and I would have my mom drive me into town so I could write letters in order to help dismantle apartheid in South Africa. And in the mid-90s, the nuclear treaties were signed and apartheid fell in South Africa. And I was convinced at the age of 15 or 16 that people can change the world. But what you have to do is show up. You've got to be there. So I kept showing up as much as I could, as best as I could. The first decade of my career, I worked in education. I worked for an AIDS service organization. I worked for museums. I led very large volunteer programs where I introduced people who were showing up to the ways that they could maximize their impact. I helped people tap into direct service work that was important to them. And in 2009, I was asked by a friend to help start up the first independent medical cannabis testing lab in the nation. In Colorado, we were starting to see the emergence of a medical cannabis industry for the first time. And the need for medicine that was tested for purity and potency was profound. No one had ever really addressed this issue before, but patients were coming to dispensaries looking for specific types of cannabis, and the best thing that you could find was information on web forums, where every time you opened up a web forum, you would find an ad of a naked woman covered in cannabis that was deeply uninviting and completely unscientific. So we were able to start to address some of those questions there. And as a former cannabis consumer at the time, I was able to learn a great deal about how medical cannabis could help those who needed it, and in fact, me again. I was able to learn enough about it that I could begin using cannabis therapeutically too. In 2012, I was honored to carry the voice of Coloradans who were seeking to end cannabis prohibition when I was the primary spokesperson and field director for Amendment 64, the first initiative in the nation to legalize cannabis for adult use. And through all of that work, I started to really understand just how deeply and tightly the tentacles of drug prohibition are woven throughout our policies. Jack just mentioned that if you're caught with cannabis, you might lose your work visa. Well, in fact, if you are not a citizen of the United States and you admit to customs or on a web forum or on a stage like this that you have ever used a currently illegal drug, you might lose your ability to re-enter the United States or to remain here. You might get deported if you are, if your immigration status is not secure. And that is one of 10,000 examples of the ways that we dehumanize and strip the dignity of people based on what they choose to put into their bodies. The war on drugs is, as all of you know, a profound disaster. But it is also so tightly woven into the ways that we think that what we really need to do is start changing the way that people think about drugs themselves and drug users. And I know y'all are with me on that for Psychedelics, and I really appreciate it. I'd like you to take a moment, if you would, to think about how you apply that question to people who use the drugs that you don't think of as being constructive. Those highly stigmatized drugs that people are using often for the same reasons that you went to find psychedelics. If we can use psilocybin to expand our empathy for the environment and trees, why is that not also expanding our empathy for people who are using heroin and methamphetamine? So, and pardon, because I'm feeling this call very strongly this weekend. I've heard a great deal of stigmatizing language, from folks in the room when we're talking about people who are experiencing a chaotic relationship with other drugs. So I'm going to take a moment of privilege to say that, most people who are using those highly stigmatized drugs are not doing so in a problematic or chaotic fashion. I missed Carl's talk because Lyft and Uber were not working this morning, but I'm sure that he spoke to that as well. And when we are thinking about how we address these policy issues, it's terrifically important that we think not just about what's going to happen when we decriminalize psychedelics or when we make them available for medical use, but what happens after. And that's the piece of this that I'm really interested in right now in our moment with Students for Sensible Drug Policy, where I'm working with young people across the globe and our allies on every continent to ensure that the work that we're doing now leads to that profound change in how we think about people, how we legalize people.
Good afternoon. My name is Carlos Plazola. First of all, I want to thank M.E.S for this conference and for inviting me. I also want to thank them for that amazing music last night, which was wonderful medicine for me. That was incredible. Thank you. And for the gentlemen who are working so hard to get this fixed, thank you. Do you see a slide up there? Yes, okay. So I'm going to work with you. Joe, maybe I'll work with you. I'm going to click it when it, and
Let's see.
if it changes, just,
Let's see if it's not quite working yet. Maybe Sandor can go.
I think they tried, but so maybe if it clicks over, sort of tell me what's on the slide. We're going to work together. Okay, I'm going to start this by, I'm going to share 4 things with you, how I got involved in this decriminalization of nature movement, how we started, what we are, and where we're going. So my own story is that on October 20th of 2018, I walked into a bedroom, locked the door behind me. I had a friend of mine watch the door, and I went into a 5-gram journey of psilocybin mushrooms. And the intention that I had going in was to finally heal 40 years of trauma that had carried through decades in my family's history, perhaps hundreds of years through colonization and being the colonizers and the colonized through many years. And that manifested within my own family, my extended family, through drug abuse, through addiction, through incarceration, through physical violence, domestic abuse, and as a being that came into this planet with a loving presence, it was very challenging to see all that and stay whole. So I worked all of my life to try to get healing. I went through, got my education, I went into science. First of all, let me just say that nature has always been my saving grace. And it was always gentle and kind with me, so I've always had a very strong affinity. But I sought healing through science, I sought healing through activism, I sought healing through fitness, I sought healing through, eventually when my body started breaking down, through yoga, which took me to meditation, and then almost daily meditation. After my mother passed, I needed to get past a lot of the trauma that ended up destroying much of my family's, extended family's cohesion. And so I got to a point where there was just emptiness. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I was stuck in the default mode network of telling myself stories that just didn't allow me to heal. So I went into this journey, and I had read Michael Pollan's book, and I said, okay, I got to try that. Before then, I had no interaction with psychedelics other than an LSD trip when I was about 17, and I was also smoking weed and drinking, so I didn't know which was which. So I wasn't really in the psychedelic community. I wasn't at all in the psychedelic community. I didn't really know what psychedelics really represented. So I went in just with faith and a desire to heal. And through that journey, it launched me. And it healed what I had been trying to heal in 40 years, 35 years of active attempts to heal. And it was tremendous. It put together a lot of pieces for me that helped me understand my entire journey in life and my how I can move forward in a way that healed me. 2 things happened. One is I was, first of all, euphoric first. And then after a few days, I began to get a little bit pissed off. Like, who the hell made these illegal? And why are they denied to so many people who need healing? And as I went out to seek community to what I understand now is called integration, I began to find this beautiful community of therapists and doctors and longtime practitioners and longtime facilitators in the Oakland area, and ran into folks like Dr. Melody Hayes and Bia Labat and Bob Stanley and Larry Norris and others who were doing tremendous work. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. And so we met and we said, well, what do we do with all this? And so we said, well, why don't we decriminalize? And so, we know I used to work in politics. So I said, I know people in politics. And Dr. Gary Kono said, why don't we just decriminalize in Oakland all entheogenic plants? And so we began that process. And when we met, we made a commitment. So now this is the part about what we are as a movement. Did it change up there? Yes. Yeah, thank you. And hopefully what you see up there is a picture of Harriet Tubman. Is it? Yes? Okay. So we made a commitment to each other that what we were going to be about was love. And it wasn't from a naive place. It was from a place of sophistication, of understanding that we heal our world when every decision we make that is of significance comes from a place of love. And when you come from a place of love, you realize that people that are trapped in their minds from trauma are enslaved. And it's the process of liberation that we chose to engage in. And so that's why Harriet Tubman is really our hero, because a small little woman 170 years ago on September 17, 3 days before International Mushroom Day, chose to liberate herself from slavery, and then not just herself, but go back and keep going back and keep going back, as Dr. Hayes talked about yesterday, until she liberated hundreds of people and helped build the Underground Railroad. And that's what we're doing. This movement is a movement of love and liberation, and it is about reaching out to those who haven't heard about the power of these healing plants and letting them know. Interestingly, our Decrim Nature movement in Oakland, since then, people in these communities who weren't necessarily accustomed to psychedelics have started hearing about the healing power of mushrooms, and they're starting to pop up in places, and people are healing themselves now using these. They're not asking for permission, nor should they. As Dr. Hart stated, it's their consciousness. And a culture is being born for these. If you give people the opportunity to free themselves, they will take it. So we are about 4 things. Does that list 4 things? Yeah? Okay. So we are about nature. We are about equitable access. We are about liberation. And I don't know, remember the... Thank you. Big one, right? Because when you experience these, you realize that our ancestors made these plants for us, right? So why would they be legalized? These were things that were co-created and co-evolved together with nature for healing community and healing us. And so that's the ancestral component. So these are the 4 things that we're about. Did it change? Yeah. Nature, thank you. So we are, as stated earlier, we're about nature. This is about a existing relationship before colonialism started, before capitalism, before the creation of large civilizations. We had this relationship with nature that was healing. And these plants are sacred in that they help us heal our consciousness. So for us, this is a movement about nature. We appreciate being embraced by the psychedelic community. We are part of that community, but really we are a different movement. We're a movement about our relationship to nature, and that's important because that resonates with people all over the U.S. What's that? Liberation. So we talked about liberation. I don't have to go into that too much, but this is, for us, what this is about. Absolutely about liberating people's bodies, and so we absolutely support ending the war on drugs. We are fully aligned, but it's also about liberating consciousness, because once they're out of prison, or to prevent them from going in prison or getting arrested or living a life of self-harm, we have to help liberate minds. So ancestral, we talked about. For those who have had deep journeys, you know that it starts tying you to your ancestry. Equitable access, thank you. And so this gets to the question about who gets to decide when someone can liberate their own consciousness. And I like to share with people that risk, like time, is relative, right? If I'm trapped, if I'm enslaved, have a different perception of risk than a doctor might have for me. And so I just want to make sure we're all respecting that, because colonialism comes in many forms, including someone telling me what is an acceptable amount of risk I can take with my life. What's this? We're growing quickly. Oh, okay, so we are an open source, so for us it's about love. We're growing quickly. This is about open source. This is about decentralization. We're supporting people. We're offering support. We're in over 100 cities now. We're in 30 states plus. There's all these cities up here that are decriminalizing, and would love to work with Austin to help here as well. Is this circles? Thank you. Okay, so there's a big circle there, and that big circle is all of us up here on stage and all of us in this room. We're all here because of love and compassion, and I say that because when we come from a place of love and compassion about talking about differences in our movements, because we have at least 3 different movements up here, and then we also need to work together to protect the sacred peyote and respect the rights of the first people of this continent, that as we work on our different policies, we'll find areas where we have some potential for challenges in our endeavors. And if you come from a place of love, compassion, and abundance, you'll find solutions. If you come from a place of fear, then you find differences, right? So I hope we can all work towards finding solutions. And the last slide is just to just show the power of the entheogenic plants and fungi. I was a real estate developer purely for profit. Afterwards, I couldn't do it for profit anymore. I had to do it to give back. And so now I've restructured my entire business model to be one of impact first investing, where we subsidize, we cap our investor returns, which I can't think of another way to reform capitalism unless you cap investor returns. At the end of the day, it either flows to them or it flows out to the people. So we cap our investor returns 7%, and then we're giving our center, the Haven, funds for healing work, groups like Sage Institute and others that are doing wonderful work. We hope to subsidize their work and the work of other healers. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I didn't think I'd need my sunglasses in here, but pretty dark and then got bright. My name is Sandor Ironrope from the Pine Ridge Agency. How many Native Americans, by a show of hands, are in here? Tribal people, indigenous people? I don't feel too outnumbered. There's two of us against that. How did I get involved into this work of policy? I was born into it in 1970 as a indigenous tribal member. If you are aware of how Indian policy has affected and shaped who we are today, you know, my mom and dad, who are not here today, my dad was born in 1928, my mom in 1934. And they didn't have the right to practice their way of life, their religion, if you will, until 1978, the American Indian Freedom Religious Act. Are you all aware of that a little bit? And so, you know, having, you know, a suppression over you, you know, I didn't understand my role. It kind of evolved with me as I aged. I served as the chairman for the Native American Church of South Dakota in 2006. I served as the vice chair for the Native American Church of North America in 2009. I served 2 terms there, and now I'm currently the chairperson of the Native American Church of South Dakota and a board member of a new organization called the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative, born last year. The issues behind peyote. The last time I was here in Austin was 2016 at the Texas Department of Public Safety with the coalition, the Native American Churches, National Council of Native American Churches, to talk about regulation of peyote, Schedule 1 substance. But as indigenous people, you know, there is a history behind suppression and the powers to be to control and regulate, you know, what is sacred to us, you know. So there's a larger understanding of plants and the indigenous people that are the caretakers of those plants. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Natalie, and those that invited me here. This is my second time coming to this platform to share a little bit about, you know, who we are. There are numerous tribes out there and in Texas that aren't federally recognized, that are only state recognized. So there's this constant struggle of recognition of who we are as indigenous people, to continue to share the balance that is needed to go forward with it. healing is needed all over the world. Healing is needed. That's an understanding. But from the indigenous perspective, trauma has been induced since day one. To understand indigenous lives, you understand the government's movements. And the broken treaties, not one was honored. The assimilation process through boarding schools. My grandpa went to Carlisle boarding school, 1879 to 1918 is when it operated. And the motto was, kill the Indian and save the man. And so a lot of indigenous tribes were sent there, and a lot of children died there. They died away from their parents. They died over there. And their hair was cut. They couldn't speak their native tongue. So when you have a little understanding of indigenous tribes within the United States, you can kind of fathom a little bit about why we would want to keep something sacred, why we would want to protect it. It's a healing life way of who we are that identifies our internal spirit and nature. And so it resonates, as I said the other day, was that, nature resonates in a certain tone and a certain melody within nature. It resonates with these medicines. And so there's the elements that are always present, within these medicines here. So there's sharing understanding about the balance that is needed to go forward with decriminalization. We were notified of the decrim movement and the concerns about our peyote was shared across the lands about what does this mean for us as indigenous people? How come nobody notified us? How come nobody said nothing? Those are the words that were shared with us. And what are we going to do? What does that mean? Does that mean it's legal for everybody? Or how does that going to affect our children, our generations? How does that affect them? Somebody has to say something. Somebody has to go over there. Talk about it. If we come from a place of love, then we should understand each other in that certain tone of love and have consideration for each other in certain aspects. If we have respect, then we could move forward. If you don't have it, then you almost have nothing with it, because love generates that respect. So through that, I'm happy to be a small part of this panel to look at how we can come to the balance of our medicines, from the indigenous perspective, So thank you. I will share that much with you. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Sandor. Thank you all. I guess we can go back to Jax now. Earlier you touched a bit upon bipartisan movement in cannabis reform. And I think to many's surprise, psychedelics similarly share really wide bipartisan or nonpartisan support. So I'm wondering if there's some lessons you might be able to share from your work in bipartisan cannabis reform that you think could be useful for us in the psychedelic movement. And I'm actually going to broaden that a bit too, and beyond the bipartisan, nonpartisan nature, what are other lessons that we can learn from cannabis reform?
I think the number one lesson that I think Texas kind of learned from other states, and so we maybe didn't necessarily replicate some of the issues that other states had, is we formed a really strong coalition where we were bringing in all kinds of stakeholders, people from, like the Liberty Caucus or the Hazlitt Institute or the Reason Foundation, but also a lot of the usual kind of people like Normal Chappers, the SSDP, people like that, so that we could all work together on it instead of trying to carve out our section of what we're going to work on, that we could all find common ground, solidify working on that together. And if there's other things that we don't necessarily agree on, understanding at least what their strategy is and choosing to, step back and let people work on what they want to work on. As far as, bipartisan support, y'all are in the South. This is a red state. And part of being effective with policy is being able to be realistic with the political landscape that you live in. This is the political landscape we live in. We do not have ballot initiative to change the laws for drugs at the state level. We have to go through our legislators. And so that means who you're voting for, what kind of races you're engaging in are really important. And in Texas, most of our competition when it comes to political races is actually in the primary election cycle. So currently we're working on the next iteration of the election guide to help people with that. But making it a bipartisan topic means that, and I think that this is the role that the psychedelic kind of aspects of all of these plant medicines play, is you have to really be able to put yourself in the perspective of this person that you're talking to that could potentially be an adversary for you, but being able to resonate with, what is their perspective? How can I take my truth and communicate it to them effectively? How can I communicate the science to them effectively? And when you find that connection and you don't start with judgment, that has really brought a lot of bonds together. And it's also made unlikely allies where we will really only just talk about cannabis because we really don't agree on anything else, and that's okay. But I think it's that kind of openness to each other, coordination within the movement, and making sure that you're proactively engaging on topics. For example, the vape crisis that's going on. You're not seeing that out of, adult use programs in other states or out of medical programs. You're seeing it mostly in the black market. We live in the black market, so we're seeing it here. So how do we as leaders, policymakers, how do we proactively start that conversation with people who are in the right position? So it's also networking with staffers. If staffers voted on the floor, we would have gotten this done, long time ago. They are your friends. And
see, stuff would move so much faster.
Yes, it really would. And so sometimes maybe that legislator, that conservative or that Democratic legislator isn't quite there, but their staff understands them best. And if you have a relationship with them, they can kind of bring that information to them in a more palatable manner. And then it's also networking with people that they listen to, a lot of bringing forth doctors, bringing forth seniors, bringing forth, all these people and coordinating them together. So I think that through working through the convention process and getting those platform planks in place, that gives us a really strong tool to go to anyone who's a legislator from Texas and be like, but the grassroots say they want it. Why are you not supporting this type of policy? But I also think that it's understanding when you have someone who's movable. There's also some people that they're not going to move on this, and you should cut your losses and move to people that have an opening that you can try to educate them on.
Thank you. Now I'm curious if Betty has anything to add with lessons from cannabis reform. And I know earlier you were kind of touching on psychedelic exceptionalism, and I know that's also been aligned with cannabis. So if you could speak a bit about that.
I remember so clearly in 2012 hearing from the psychedelic community, which I wasn't particularly connected with at the time, about cannabis exceptionalism and how frustrated I'm sure some of you in the room were with the idea of cannabis being held as different than, or more ready for regulation than, or better than other substances. And it's so interesting to me to integrate those lessons that I learned then about how important our messaging was and try to apply them here as we're thinking about the advancement of psychedelic therapy and how we are making psychedelics exceptional now in the ways that we're talking about it. So I do think that that's an important thing to consider. When we're talking about, for example, healing from or recovery from a chaotic relationship with a substance of any sort, whether that be pharmaceutical or alcohol or tobacco or a currently illegal drug, that we think about how we are framing up our messaging in ways that ultimately undermine that healing. And so, I hear from people that, in this community that psychedelics are going to cure addiction. And for some people, that is true. And for some people, that is not. And we need to be very careful about how we're framing up our messages. In that time, what I figured out was the people who are still attached to the prohibitionist mindset, the people who are, still believing what they learned through DARE, what they learned through the public messaging of the 80s, 90s, and today, frankly, are operating from a place of fear. So much of our response to drugs and the people who use them is coming from a place of fear. And in particular, for those people who are sympathetic to the rest of our argument, but are afraid of what's going to happen as we advance these reforms, first and foremost, we have to address that fear. But we also have to recognize that our opponents, the people who continue to push these messages, know to use that fear. So they can trigger somebody's fear brain very easily by referring back to those messages that people have been learning for so long. Whereas we must always stand in our truth and be very clear and precise and honest about what the opportunities, challenges, and risks are of the work that we're doing. So that's one of the things that I learned that I hope that we can begin to integrate a little more carefully in some of the ways that we're talking about this work as advocates, activists, and messengers ourselves. But I also am very deeply concerned about how we go about doing this work. I was terrifically naive about the power of capitalism in 2012. I had no effing clue, you guys. I'd spent my entire life in the nonprofit world. I had read some economics in college. I had, built all of these ideas about how the world ought to be. And I thought, okay, if we're going to legalize cannabis, then we're going to start to undo some of these harms. We're going to be able to repair some of the harms of the war on drugs. We're going to make things better for the people of color who are disproportionately targeted 8-to-1 in terms of law enforcement. And it's going to be magical. It's not magical. And neither is the psychedelics policy work. I hate to break it to you. There's lots of magic in this room, and there are lots of magical things that we can do together. But when it comes to applying our work, our passions, our experiences to the policies that are going to result, we need to be strategic, thoughtful, careful, and incredibly critical when we're thinking about how we go about these policies. If you had told me that business interests would become entrenched and start to engage in regulatory capture activities the day after we passed that initiative, I would have dismissed that idea. But that's what happened. I sat in working groups in Colorado where I literally watched business people trade away the right for people who had been convicted of cannabis crimes to work in the industry for their own business interests, to consolidate their own wealth. And that same kind of thing can happen anywhere. So when we're thinking about how we move psychedelic policy reform forward, we absolutely must be centering ourselves in what is most important about how we protect this medicine and the access to it, and even those people who are not using it as medicine. And so I think that if we're thinking about what's critically important here, we have to make sure that we're doing things like protecting home grow of cannabis, of psilocybin, of plant medicines, no matter where we're talking about these issues. Let's protect some home grow, you guys. It's really important. We need to make sure that, yes, of course, MDMA in that therapeutic setting needs to come from, and I'm working with an amazing group of global experts on a regulation project right now that we're launching next week at the Reform Conference. If you want to learn more, you can go to thedrugstore.works and sign up, and we'll send you some information as soon as we can. But as we're thinking about these issues, let's really think carefully about what we are demanding because it's appropriate, ends up in that the systems that are existing and where we can build new systems to enhance people's lives in new kinds of ways. And so that's the sort of thing that we're all thinking about when it comes to these deep regulatory questions of not only how do we decriminalize, how do we make available for therapeutic use, but how do we regulate substances according to their risks in the most appropriate fashion in a way that helps build people.
Thank you. Carlos, can you tell us a bit about why you decided to work to decriminalize nature and not just psilocybin, as Denver had done, and there are other movements focused on a single substance?
Yes, happy to. I do want to, though, piggyback real quick for 30 seconds. From 2002 to 2019, I was involved in the cannabis industry, first as legislative side, then lobbying, helping pass legislation, and then finally as an owner of a dispensary, which I've since let go. And I boil it down to three things that should not happen or should be protected. First is don't limit the number of plants that people can grow for themselves through home growth for personal use. Treat them as plants. Getting to what you said. Number two is don't create some new crazy regulatory framework. We have frameworks for everything in the U.S. Don't treat plants like they're some kind of weird thing. Just pull them into existing frameworks. And the third thing is watch out for venture capital. And somehow through social media, through marketing, through collective pressure, through regulatory frameworks, control venture capital, or else you'll lose the process. So as somebody who's been in the capitalist world for a while, so the question of why we chose all plants, well, because all plants, first of all, there is a very large ayahuasca, ibogaine community and San Pedro community in the Bay Area, and people healing from those. And so there was just a lot of voices coming from those communities. Some of the most powerful ones were from ibogaine, where they're treating veterans with severe PTSD and where they're treating people with severe addictions and getting great results. And so we wanted to respect that and honor that, but also just fit really well into all of our collective, the leaders' collective recognition that this is really a movement about nature and about allowing us to have access to healing plants that really are our right to have access to. And so that's why we chose multiple plants. And then I do want to say about peyote, I want to thank Sandor, I want to thank Miriam Balot, and I want to thank Don Davis, and again, Bia, for bringing forth the issue that we simply missed in our resolution. And I'd like to ask everyone who's here who's pushing decriminalization is please remove the word peyote or Native American church from any resolution that's been circulated. It was just an oversight. We didn't get everything perfect, and we're still going to keep learning in the process. And to love is to learn, to love is to be humble. And so we listened, and we're now pushing others to remove it. So thank you.
And I want to I do really want to thank Carlos and being at the forefront of things and moving things forward. Of course, we're going to be learning, and it's really inspiring for us at M.E.S to see as other groups around the country are coming to you and you're able to share lessons learned and unintended consequences that these reforms can have on Native American communities and scarce peyote resources. And I guess along those lines, Sandor, if you could maybe share with folks who are interested in developing movements for psychedelic reform, what are some of the ways people can most sincerely honor and work in solidarity with Native American communities in these reforms and avoid this concept of cultural appropriation is something I've heard brought up throughout this conference, and kind of avoid that. And I guess I would be curious what that means to you in the context of psychedelic reform, and even the words. I know we've had conversation about the word psychedelic, even what that means to you.
So your question is around
how people interested in movements for psychedelic reform can more sincerely honor and collaborate with Native American communities and ensure that there aren't any unintended consequences, and that their work is honoring and learning from communities who have been working with these medicines for much longer than they have.
I wanted to thank the decriminalization for allowing the indigenous voice to come in and to be able to work with us, because I think that's the doorknob turning, to open up an understanding. The Native American communities have challenges and have always had challenges, with that term appropriation, this term psychedelics, these terminologies that the community uses here, we're not really familiar with, and then the word commercialization, that term too, it scares us because for indigenous tribes, you've been stripped of everything. You have to understand that, when you don't have nothing and you've been suppressed, you're lesser than, this America was born on the Iroquois Confederacy, the documentation, theories, but that challenge of coming up and being proud of who we are, it's barely coming to light. We're in 2019 going on, we're barely here. The Redskins, the NFL team, there's a constant struggle to recognize, when Halloween comes around, everybody dresses up as Indians, there's a movement that says that my culture is not a costume. It's an ongoing challenge, and part of meeting that challenge is me being here and listening, and vice versa, listening here. Appropriation, what is it? Even in the Native American church, as the National Council, we fought against, churches in a sense that wanted to use marijuana in their ceremonies as Native American church. Those are real issues that we as indigenous people have been facing. Authenticity, I just found out that the DNA test came back that I'm like 0.00% Native American, and that means I could wear a bonnet. The concept of misunderstanding, it's a continuum, to be there to sift through who is who and what is what, and to come to an understanding of where that information or that lineage, your blood lineage, come from, and what did you learn? Did you learn it from a book, or did you learn it from your elderlies? Those kind of things are important to us to try to find that balance of, respect, respecting. Some Lakota people, Lakota, also known as Sioux people, we are Lakota people. Anybody see Dances with Wolves? Oh, I feel better. Who we are as Lakota people, we pride ourselves on respect. We pride ourselves on respect. We don't say names, we say kinship first. We have a philosophy of mitakwe oyase, all my relations, that encompasses everything around you, the elements and all plant life, all animal life, everything about life, because what we do is about life. So there's a broader understanding, a cultural understanding that, I encourage others to learn about, and part of that is, the balance of indigenous communities wanting to share or not to share. If we share, look what happened when we shared. They just took it all and then, profited it from it, So there's that balance as indigenous communities, because we have a responsibility, and all of us have that responsibility to your children and your generations. Just as like my parents did, my grandparents were born here in generations, but they weren't even citizens until 1924 in their own country. So this understanding about our responsibility today, part of my generation is to understand that balance where we're at today with the decrim, and our medicine. How do we find that balance? It's a continuum of learning cultural perspectives, and that's just what I wanted to encourage, with that. So,
Thank you.
Can I add a little something to that? I want to just reflect from a statutory perspective how much slavery and racism and that institution has been enmeshed and codified into the world that's around us. For example, in Texas, the statutory spelling for cannabis, they call it marijuana, is actually marijuana with an H, because they could not even be bothered to know the people enough to learn how to spell the word properly. And then we have studies where you were talking about the disparity in arrest rates. You know, there's some counties in Texas where you're 34 times more likely to be arrested if you're a person of color. And the police chiefs held a press conference up at the Capitol, and they actually said that, well, they don't really take the ACLU seriously. They don't find that to be true in their experience. And so they're also minimalizing this. So it's a multi-front attack where we have to, be the best allies that we can be to make sure that we are remembering our role and our place is to help facilitate Native people, patients, and others to be able to live their best life without the intervention of the government dictating who can do what and whose customs or traditions are valid. And so I just wanted to reflect back to you that that's something that we definitely have to work on here in Texas and across the whole world, really.
Thank you.
You have a microphone.
I do have a mic. So my next question is really for all of you. And then talking about new ways forward, and we've been talking about kind of lessons and maybe mistakes from cannabis, but I'm curious if there are any visions you have for these new models and new ways of reforming policy and new ways of building psychedelic community. And I know I did say I'm tossing it to all of you, but I'm now remembering a conversation I had with Sandor, and you were telling me a bit about a community healing center and how that intersected with kind of community integration. And I thought maybe you could start us off speaking a bit about that community healing center.
Community?
And the community center that you were telling me about.
Okay. But I will say a little bit on, the reform of our plant-based medicines. There is some considerations for the Oglala Sioux tribe to pass policies internally about medicinal marijuana. Although marijuana isn't grown in our area or was never used in our ceremonies, there was some consideration about, the pros and cons of, people that were arrested. What were they arrested for? What was, the aggressive tendencies versus non-aggressive, And so there is consideration, and I think there's some movement in supporting that, So I'm kind of happy about that because we're actually saving lives, in doing that, Part of the healing that we're faced with today as a Lakota tribe, we were hunter-gatherers, and last year we harvested a buffalo, and so our life and our stories have evolved around the Buffalo Nation. And when you look at reservation life, reserves, or residential schools or boarding schools, there's a constant need of healing because we used to live off the land. We used to go hunting, and I know Texas is big on hunting. I'm looking forward to hunting when I get home. But, so now it's about empowering our own people. There are healing mechanisms on our tribe. There's a gardening project in Thunder Valley that is going on that I'm going to learn more about too. In the organization that we created, it's called The Beginning of a Sacred Home, because everything is learned in the home or is supposed to be learned in the home. It's called Tiognaka Tawa Otoke. And so it's a movement to strive to heal our own people through nutrition, through exercise. I used to be a strength coach for the diabetes program in Indian Health Services. And so the holistic in nature, hunting your food, respecting nature, planting some food. Although we were never hunter-gatherers, we support community gardens, to have that nutrition, because nutrition is important. It affects the way you think, your body, and to have access to clean water. I mean, that's, a concern all over the world, clean water, And so that, those that understood Standing Rock understood what we were fighting for, clean water, you know. So TTO is holistic in nature to create that understanding and supporting the culture and language within it too. And there are other organizations on our reservation, although we are off the reservation. We're located in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Anybody ever hear of Crazy Horse Monument? Yeah, we're not too far from there. So it's in the center, in the heart of the Black Hills, and part of that understanding came from my sister as well, who's not here with us. Her name is Carol. Her name was Carol Einrup Herrera, and she was an instrumental tool in nurturing the womanhood society, because my mom was a midwife at one time, and to understand healthy generations, to know where your placenta is going, you know, to know where that is being planted, because that child shares that connection with that, and who was to receive the baby, you know, and not spank the baby, you know. So there was a whole array of womanhood teachings that my mom passed to my sister, that it incorporates who we are as TTO, you know, the balance of male and female in the creation of our stories and how we are, but to ensure that, you know, our members receive that health, that good nutrition, and that carries on in a domino effect of changing your perspective, because where we are today is just in survival mode, you know. Our mind is in survival mode. We can't really find that happiness because we're trying to just survive. So by allowing some healing to happen, to show how important it is to hunt, respectfully hunt and gather your food, you know, and to be proactive in nurturing Mother Earth through planting your food and receiving that blessing. So that kind of turns off back over into the peyote concept, of which I'll talk about later on today, is IPCI. And that's start of nurturing it. We can't be lazy in what we're doing, because the Creator created our hands to work and to provide. So part of that providing is getting into Mother Earth and planting and taking care of our medicines, because that's the first energy in our spiritual aura. We ask this medicine, we present ourselves to nature in this medicine, and if we're going to make a harvest, there is a prayer, there is a song that resonates with these plants. And so we are about that, you know. So that's part of what TTO stands for, is to create that holistic perspective in healing our Lakota people.
Thank you.
Was the question where we go from here for healing
New models forward and ways maybe of reducing potential harms with decriminalization.
Thank you. I'd like to get kind of right to the root of something for me, and I tell my kids that, you know, life really is simple. You complicate it, but it really is simple. We complicate it. Western society, since the advent of scientific reductionism and capitalism, all these things, they're information-based, but they're not wisdom-based. And that's led us towards environmental catastrophe, right? Climate change, loss of species, loss of connection with each other. And so we're sort of like children playing with this new technology. But the ancient wisdoms of people who learned from the natural rhythms of the land, that's real. That's real wisdom. And this is one of the great realizations that I've had over the last year and that's where I was kind of lost, is thinking that I would find the answers if I just read one more physics book or one more math book. And it's not in there, right? It's not in studies, it's not in data. Wisdom is not in there. Yes, we can grow better products. We can have, I love my iPhone, but it's not wisdom. And so in order to learn wisdom, we have to infuse our life with the ancient knowledge and wisdom that's been passed on from traditions and lineages, and respect it, honor it, and ask for it humbly. So when I look in Oakland and where we're going, I would love to work with folks who bring the ancient wisdom to teach us how to use these plants well in tradition, and look for lineages that actually go back to deep ancient knowledge of living from the land. So I think it starts there, and then we can layer on the complexities of scientific research. Thank you.
I'm so excited for this world that you see. both of you. And I am called personally to think about what is most urgent. And I also want to make a quick shout out. If you are hearing this notion of colonization within psychedelics and the work that we're doing and the drug war for the first time and would like an introduction to it, I invite you to visit the blog at ssdp.org and search for a post about colonization and the war on drugs, written by a dreamer who's a member of SSDP named Arturo Lua, who did a wonderful job of laying out a base level understanding and pointing to some resources there. But I'm called to what's most urgent right now, which is addressing the overdose crisis. And we have an opportunity today, right now, to bring safe consumption facilities to the United States. There are many cities that are working on that, including Oakland and San Francisco, Seattle, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and many others. And it is terrifically important that we create a space where people who are using highly stigmatized drugs are able to access services, care, and a place where they are treated with dignity, first and foremost. Around the world, people have engaged in millions of injections of highly stigmatized drugs in these facilities, and there has never been a fatal overdose in one of these facilities because the treatment is there and ready to go. So please, as you are moving forward with your decriminalization initiatives, be sure to pay attention to what else is happening in the landscape. I'm really excited to work with Carlos and the folks at Decriminalize Nature to ensure that we can begin to put some information out to his constituents, our constituents, about how our movements can align together. Because we actually have an opportunity not just to decriminalize plant medicines, but to decriminalize all drugs. One month ago, the Cato Institute released a study of 1,700 people in America, or a poll of 1,700 people in America that demonstrated not only we've known for many years that a majority of Americans would rather approach, drug-related problems for people with treatment than criminalization. That's true. What people hadn't done was realize that what they're saying when they answer that question is that they want to decriminalize all drugs. But a month ago, 55% of Americans said affirmatively they would like to decriminalize all drugs. So let's do it. Let's get that done. And then once we've done that, let's think about what it looks like to really give people the information at point of sale that they need and give the people a community of other people who are using drugs to understand the sort of supports that they might need before, during, and after their experiences. And that regulation project, which I mentioned, which is launching next week, is the way that we are going to show people precisely how it gets done. We have the answers. We're pulling them together from a vast network of highly qualified resources, and we are going to be presenting a model for how we go about regulating all drugs according to their harms and creating this mechanism in the real world so that we can start to build toward that future.
Amazing. And I want to just add a few things to what Betty was sharing, because I think a lot of folks, in my experience with psychedelic reformers, feel that maybe working with, heroin users would be too stigmatizing and psychedelics are controversial enough. But in fact, there have been a few situations where folks working on opiate-related reforms have actually helped the psychedelic movement. So I just want to name some of those. One is around drug checking. And for substances like MDMA, the majority of black market MDMA is adulterated with many other substances. And the movement that pushed to decriminalize drug checking in Maryland and is doing that around the country was initiated by fentanyl testing, because so much of the heroin was contaminated. But that applies to all folks, not just opiate users. And one other point I want to bring up around that is something I believe you brought up around police diversion, and that there have been different cities. I know Seattle's LEAD program is working with police to, instead of arrest drug users, to divert them to services, or maybe to be working with social workers for outreach. And I think this is something really, really important for psychedelic reformers to keep in mind, because as we all know, and we know from the work that Zendo Project does, people can have very difficult experiences with psychedelics and can have what Stan Groff will call spiritual emergencies. And police officers engaging with folks having spiritual emergencies on the street do not really usually end up very well, especially if those officers are not educated and trained beforehand. So we think there's a lot to learn from these diversion programs and working with social workers, working with how to support people having those difficult psychedelic experiences. And the broader movement for drug policy reform has already been doing that. So there's a lot of overlap there. But
I'll just touch real quickly because I know we're getting close on time. But one thing that this is my personal opinion, that something I've noticed from talking to people is that there's kind of been this generational feel of just take a pill to fix it, just go get an injection to fix it, just go do this and that, and it's simple. And pharmaceutical companies have really optimized on that. And I think that people discovering more and more the natural ways that we live with plants, taking supplements, eating well, taking care of their body, that they can start to understand more about how plants can really be medicine. And I think that, cannabis can definitely have more research be done on it, but, we're here to stop harms. We're not here to legislate or dictate what people put in their bodies. So I think that that's really important. I think one thing that M.E.S has done really well on this conference, this is my first time, I'm a newbie. I've been to the dinners, but not a conference, so I'm loving it. But one thing that I think has really been great is the focus on the science, because for those that maybe still are somewhat bigoted or not connected to the earth or are not in the same place that we are, they might listen more to the science. And then if they don't want to listen to the science, because let me tell you, there are those that do not and will not believe a scientific study if you put it before them, you have to really figure out what makes them tick. And it might be a personal story. It might be actually someone near them talking about it and it affecting them. So we're going to have to really customize it because, what's happening in California is vastly different than what is happening here in Texas. And so whenever I'm talking about harm reduction, that means, can we not arrest 60,000 Texans again this year, please? Can we please make sure that patients can have safe access to medical cannabis? Can we make sure that we have a regulated adult use market so that people are not getting lung issues from having these bad vape cartridges that we're only really finding on the black market? So I'm there all the way till the end, but where are we gonna meet for middle ground along the way? And that's how we're going to make different movements. And I've been talking to some people about, what are the next steps for psychedelics, other psychedelics outside of cannabis in Texas. And I think that the best way to start is at those local levels, doing resolutions with the city councils and educating locally and engaging with law enforcement proactively. Many of us look at law enforcement as the enemy, and there's a lot of reason to do so, but they hold a great amount of power with the legislators. And that's how our state works. So we have to engage proactively with them. And there are a lot of law enforcement officers that are joining the team, and they are trying to make amends for the deeds that they've done in the past. So I think that I've heard a lot about, you need to have taken this psychedelic to be able to work for or on this psychedelic, but we need to openly embrace people who may be just the squarest squares, but they believe in medical freedom, and bring them along with us and just be a very welcoming society and community.
I think we have time for 2 questions. Is that? I'm going to open up for questions.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. This has been really great. I've enjoyed this discussion. I just, as a parent, I know that when we're going to want to change the culture, we want to decriminalize, it starts with how we teach our children and what we teach our children in schools. A lot of us went through DARE, and there's still, my kindergartner came home with a ribbon attached to his shirt last week that said, "My choice, my future, drug-free." And he's 5. I was like, "What is a drug?" And he's like, "Oh, medicine." And I really want to be open and authentic and honest with the way I talk to my kids about this, but it's also tricky because it's still in this illegal zone. So I just wondered if you had thoughts on, how we talk to kids in our schools, like young kids, and also how do we, assuage the fears of people who think that expanding access is going to mean that kids are going to have access to this too. So if you could talk on that, thanks.
Do you mind if I just real quick? So I have a 9-year-old and I work in marijuana policy. So we talk about marijuana all the time, but we try to keep it very age appropriate. There's even some children's books out there that you can purchase and do that. And I think that it's talking to them first of all about how nature works, how plants works. My mother was kind of like a naturalist, so we took a lot of plant-based medicine. So I think it's easy to have that conversation, but also having the conversation about, I'm not sure where you're from, but with my child, I had to have the conversation about, do you say marijuana, and my mom works in marijuana, to your teacher? Unfortunately, there is, in these prohibition states, still a level of where we need to protect our children and protect ourselves. So I think that it's a difficult space to navigate. Honesty is always more important, and that's worked really well for me with my kiddo, and we've never had any issues with the school or CPS. And secondly, people are very judgmental on how we treat pregnant women and children medicinally. And there are a lot of children who need medical cannabis, period. Why are we damaging their livers and their kidneys when there's a safer option? It should be the first line of defense, these holistic therapies, rather than the last line of defense.
And I have to add, there's still mothers today losing their children for their cannabis use, and much more commonly happens to mothers of color. I just want to highlight that.
Yeah, this is a really tricky one, legally, socially, culturally, and the rest. And so everything that Jack said and everything that Natalie said. And there are some great resources out there available to you. And I want to point to two of them. Our allies at the Drug Policy Alliance have created a resource called Safety First. Safety First is designed for middle and high school students, and it's a complete curriculum that can be delivered in schools around age-appropriate drug education. There's also a resource that we've developed at SSDP, which is a groundbreaking peer-to-peer drug education program. Again, a curriculum that can be delivered on campus and in communities for people in high school, college, and beyond. And anyone is able to access that information at, it's called Just Say No, K-N-O-W. Important clarification there. So please do check out those resources.
Another question?
Thank you, Carlos and Sandor, everybody up there, thank you. I resonated, Carlos and Sandor, with what you were talking about. Yeah, okay. And here's my question. It's about resources, elders who can be available to people who have been colonized. My family, well, I'm a therapist and I work a lot with kids who have been ripped away from families through ICE and also that are going through revolution in Central America. I also have roots from Mexico and de Colombia. When I came over here, I was spit at and called names by teachers because I was speaking my Spanish. Pero I didn't know, that I was part of an indigenous culture. No sabía, I didn't know. And, when I slowly started to come to that, I realized that I was missing a lot. And I was missing elders, people who could get me back in touch with my roots. And my question is this. What is your take on people who have been ripped away and are still trying to find their way? In my opinion, Hispanics, somos indígenas, some of us have forgotten it. And so my question is, how do we reintegrate?
How do we reintegrate?
Reintegrate?
See, reintegrate, or at least get in touch with us.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think my take on it is, we are at a constant revitalization of our indigenous roots. And so what I've seen so far is that the Native American church and the peyote way of life has awakened the indigenous roots of a lot of people. It has, made that prideness of who you are, even in Texas, because you have state recognized tribes, you have tribes that aren't even recognized. IPCI is a coalition of indigenous tribes from Mexico and the United States. The Wivarika Nation, also known as the Huichol people, we have incorporated them into this peyote preservation concept. But the medicine itself works in such a way that revitalizes that. And we see that. And we encourage that to have that spiritual and tribal identity, because that's who we are. But there's that balance also into, when we talk about indigenous or elders' wisdoms, everything deals with the spiritual world. And so in light of the colonizers to take, it's a take that we're kind of reserved on, because it deals with the spiritual world. It deals with the spiritual world with these plants, medicines. And so if you don't, adhere to the spirit of things, then you yourself are not promoting healing. You're going to lose somebody. So it deals with the spiritual world of what we're doing here. And that's why it's important to, go and understand indigenous perspectives, where they say, well, why do you Indians don't smile? It's that stoic look that, well, you're still trying to figure out what you're going to do, kind of like that. But there is that balance in it. But thank you for that, because I support, the revitalization of our indigenous roots.
I'd like to offer my perspective on that as a Mexicano. My grandmother was indigenous. She is from Jalisco, but I didn't know her. I don't know her ways. Unfortunately, they were lost through colonialism. But I know that nature has a voice, right? And you sit in nature and you listen and you hear it, and you shut off the brain for a moment and just listen and you feel it. And there are many traditions that have grown from that for many thousands of years and carried that, and as a community evolved in that and learned the wisdom of how to live together and peacefully and in harmony with themselves and in nature. And that's not a romanticized perspective, that's real. And so I can't go back to my grandmother and hear her in her lessons. I'm of this world, but I can go back to people who haven't lost that tradition and ask them and humbly listen, not from my Western perspective, but to shut up my own voice for a moment and just listen. And I think that's what we can do.
Really beautiful note to end on. I really want to thank all of you for being here and for this conversation. And thank you all.